My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask your pardon for my sins and the grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Today's optional memorial Mass is irresistible. We commemorate the spiritual showdown on Mount Carmel between the one remaining prophet faithful to God versus 450 false prophets. The scene has much to teach us about firmness of convictions and the effective transmitting of our ideals. Israel, led astray by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, had fallen into idolatry, worshipping Baal and abandoning the Lord. Elijah the prophet confronted King Ahab and said, "Send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel." And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Elijah then challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to a public test. The true God would answer by fire from heaven. Well, to refresh your memory of how the showdown turned out, pull out your copy of the Bible, the one passed down to you from your grandparents, and read from the first book of Kings, chapter 18. What interests us in this time of prayer is how Elijah stood alone against overwhelming opposition, showing the importance of courage and conviction in upholding truth, even when it is unpopular or even dangerous. His actions remind us that faithfulness may require standing apart from the crowd. But thinking about those 450 prophets who had gone off and worshipped Baal, and by the way, Baal is spelled B-A-A-L. Those 450, how did they arrive at that lamentable state? How could they have abandoned the God of their ancestors en masse? Keep in mind that this event took place in the 9th century before Christ, more than 400 years after Moses. Who knows what deceived them? What matters to us is learning from their mistakes. We can imagine that they had abandoned the study of God's revelation, thereby cutting themselves off from centuries of wisdom. These days, nobody goes around making reference to Baal. They would not even know how to spell that name. Nevertheless, social media is bursting with influencers and podcasters who have no use for history. They spurn the spiritual and human riches that we have inherited from past generations, and they are ignorant of everything that came before them. G.K. Chesterton wrote, "Those who leave the tradition of truth do not escape into something we call freedom. They escape into something else called fashion." And you will no doubt recall his observation. When men and women cease to believe in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. You might be thinking, yeah, but that was so long ago, and I've never even heard of Baal. Well, as a matter of fact, this episode of Elijah finding himself all alone is reenacted every day. It could so easily happen that we feel all alone in our beliefs. The student who is the only one among his friends who still goes to Mass. the young professional who is the only one who does not live with his or her boyfriend or girlfriend. The couple who are ostracized because they want to have yet another child. In these circumstances, it is only natural to wonder, am I the only one left? You can almost hear Elijah saying to you, welcome to the club. All of us will eventually be confronted by 450 followers of who knows what pseudo-philosophy of life. It will then be important to understand why so many people are falling in line, so to speak, doing what everyone else does without giving it a second thought. Well, underlying this herd instinct of following the latest fad is a seriously deficient knowledge of the faith. It is all too easy to put aside the study of our beliefs. But without a deep knowledge of our faith, anyone can succumb to the siren song of popular opinion. Pope Francis wrote the following to young people. I have seen young and beautiful trees, their branches reaching to the sky, and they seemed a song of hope. Later, following a storm, I would find them fallen and lifeless. They lacked deep roots. They spread their branches without being firmly planted, and so they fell as soon as nature unleashed her power. They lacked deep roots. Those are truly haunting words. How often does someone say to us, I used to be Catholic, but I gave that up long ago? The chances are high that coloring books were the main vehicle for their early religious education. In other words, they know nothing. Pope Francis continues, that is why it pains me to see young people sometimes being encouraged to build a future without roots, as if the world were just starting now. For it is impossible for us to grow unless we have strong roots to support us and to keep us firmly grounded. It is easy to drift off when there is nothing to clutch onto. We all need to sink deep roots. But how? There are no shortcuts. Daily spiritual reading, careful study of the Catholic Catechism, doctrine classes, in a word, study. Why is cohabitation deadly? What does the Church teach about IVF and euthanasia? And what are the reasons for those teachings? What really happened in the Crusades, the Galileo affair, and so forth? Speaking of history, knowledge of the history of the Church is vital for combating the so-called black legends that continue to influence people who have shallow roots. In this context, it is worth mentioning an important new book by Anthony Schratz called Paradise Cancelled. The author's last name is spelled S-C-H-R-A-T-Z. Well, that brings up an interesting question. How should we deal with these kinds of situations when they arise? When we find ourselves dealing with someone who has gone off following the wrong idea of life? Well, just as Elijah, we have several powerful weapons at our disposal. In the first place, God's grace. When we're dealing with a friend who stubbornly holds on to the idea of living with his or her boyfriend, girlfriend, we have to be praying for that person, because God's grace can enter into their heart, their will, change their vision of things. Then comes truth. 60 years ago, in 1965, the Second Vatican Council declared the following: the truth does not impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power. And then that surprising element, meekness. Recall the Beatitude. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Do not confuse meekness with style, with being shy, timid. We need to be robust, forthright, confident. You can hardly picture Elijah being shy, but he was meek. He calmly but forcefully dismantled that belief system of the 450, speaking very little and relying on the power of God. As one author puts it, the word of truth, if spoken by the meek, is like a sword that severs soul and body, subtly insinuating itself like a breath of love into the innermost recesses of the soul. True victory over the world is reserved for the meek, because it is not they themselves who conquer, but rather Christ in them and through them. And so it is God's grace, the power of truth, and a friendly approach, all those that conquer the false prophets. By the way, it is important to avoid coming across as shrill or smug. And certainly going on the warpath is counterproductive. Far more effective is dealing with individuals one by one in the context of a friendly exchange of views. After all, it is God's grace and His truth that will do all the heavy lifting. Finally, today's memorial of Our Lady of Mount Carmel may bring to your mind the scapular of Our Lady and the beautiful promise that Mary gave us in the year 1251. At that time she appeared to St. Simon Stock, who was the prior general of the Carmelite order. Mary handed him a large cloth scapular and said, "Whoever dies in this garment shall not suffer eternal fire." A wonderful way to honor Our Lady will be to renew our love for this deeply rooted Marian devotion. And if you have never been enrolled in the scapular, to arrange for that brief ceremony in the coming days. I thank you, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you have communicated to me in this meditation. I ask your help in putting them into effect. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.